Welcome, viewers. I am Dr. Mark Medley, Professor of Theology at Baptist Seminary of Kentucky. And as part of the North American Baptist Fellowship Scholars Group, I am delighted to interview Dr. David Emmanuel Goatley, also a member of the Scholars Group, on the occasion of the 25th anniversary publication of his book. I'm going to hold up my original copy, Were You There? Godforsakenness and Slave Religion. Dr. Goatley is Associate Dean for Academic and Vocational Formation, the Ruth W. and A. Morris Jr. Research Professor of Theology and Christian Ministry, and Director of the Office of Black Church Studies at Duke Divinity School. David, that's a mouthful. It's a lot of titles, a lot of responsibility on your shoulders at Duke. And I know that you can handle every bit of that. Prior to going to Duke Divinity School, Dr. Goatley was the Executive Secretary Treasurer of the Loch Carey Baptist Foreign Mission Society for 20 plus years.
22 years.
22 years. Prior to that, he was a professor at Memphis Theological Seminary. Had also taught at the University of Louisville. David was also a longtime pastor of a number of churches in Kentucky. He is an ordained minister in the National Baptist Convention USA, has served in leadership capacities with the NAACP, along with the Loch Carey Baptist Foreign Mission Society, has been active in the Baptist World Alliance and the World Council of Churches as well, also holding leadership responsibilities in both of those organizations. He is an author of many reviews, articles, book chapters. The book we're going to be talking about here in a few moments, as well as two other books, A Divine Assignment, The Missiology of Wendell Clay Somerville, and Missions is Essential, as well as the editor of a collected essays of J.D. Otis Roberts, one of his theological mentors. David is a graduate of University of Louisville, as well as a two-time graduate from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I'm going to say that's where I met David a good while back, as we were both students at Southern Seminary at the same time, and got to know each other when we were both in the theology department pursuing our doctoral degrees. And David, if memory serves, not only did we have a lot of seminars and colloquiums together, I think in one seminar we even co-wrote a paper together, I think for Dr. Marshall's class, which was, I have really vivid memories of that whole experience, and they're all positive. You carried me, so in that endeavor. So let me just ask. I've listed off a number of things about your biography. Is there anything else that you would like to add about your vocation as a theologian, a scholar, administrator, leader of an international missions organization, a pastor, anything else that you would like to add?
Well, Mark, it's great to visit with you in this way, and I'm very appreciative for you and the NABF scholars for giving me an opportunity to talk about the 25th anniversary release of Were You There? Godforsakenness and Slave Religion. So I want to say first thanks, and appreciate your generous introduction. I think the main thing that I'd like to mention is, rather than the specifics, is that the arc of my vocation it started with being an urban missionary, then a pastor, then academic, then a global missions executive, and now I'm back in the academy. And so in the words of, as you mentioned, J.D. Otis Roberts, to borrow his phrase, he talked about living with one foot in the academy and one in the church. And I think for me, I would say I have, for the most of the time, tried to live with feet in both places. And for me, when I talk about the church, I don't mean a local congregation, but I mean the global church. So I've been blessed to be able to try to serve with feet both in the global church and in the academy, and
Yeah.
that informs how I guess those ministry opportunities have informed who I am and how I think. Rather than some people would say the way that they're thinking informs what they do.
Yeah.
I think what we do
Important.
largely affects
Yeah.
who we are and how we function. So that's kind of how I understand my own vocational journey. Not linear, but doing more than one thing at once in terms of those two ways. So thanks for the invitation to reflect on that.
My pleasure. And yeah, oftentimes in seminaries we talk about wanting to have both feet, one foot in the academy, one foot in the church. And when I think of that aspiration, you're one of the examples that I always have in mind. Having followed, I'm continued our friendship over the years. I know following you on Facebook and things, and knowing your work in the church global, and so it's as well as your work in the academy and got feet firmly planted in both. And so that's just a testimony to viewers to say yeah, excellent. So
thanks.
Can you also believe it's 25 years since the publication of Were You There? So I'm glad Wipf and Stock. I should probably mention to everyone the 25th anniversary issue or edition of the book is published by Wipf and Stock, which you should be able to find online at wipfandstock.com, as well as other online book retailers. It should be available. It is available now, and so yeah, I need to mention that. So, well, let's just jump into some questions here that I have. One of the things that's to me, I always talk about this with students, is that in many ways the practice of theology is autobiographical, and in the preface to the original edition of the book, you talk about a trip that you took to Buenos Aires in 1992 and how significant that trip was for you personally, as well as the impact that trip had on you theologically. Could you talk about that more about that experience and how and its transformational character, as well as any other subsequent experiences that have shaped how you address the central question in your book, where is God in this? So love to hear about those experiences.
Yeah, that was a very meaningful experience that was a part of my studies. Prior to that, however, I had an opportunity in 1989 to participate in a preaching mission with the Foreign Mission Board of the National Baptist Convention USA. And we spent some time altogether, I think it was 22 days. And we spent some time in Liberia and then some time in Malawi. And interestingly, in Liberia, we were there maybe in February, and then in June was when civil war broke out. So it was very tense.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of civil unrest because even prior to that had been an assassination of Dr. William Talbert, who was also a Baptist pastor and the president of the country. Also had been a president of Baptist World Alliance. So it was difficult, and there was unrest, and that was a bit disorienting. Walter Brueggemann talks about in the theology of the Psalms that the Psalms are beloved by people in part because they reflect something of life in terms of seasons of orientation, seasons of disorientation, and seasons of new orientation. And it's not linear. And in depending on where you are and what parts of your life, you may be at a different place personally than you are vocationally, or so it's not all a neat package. But that was disorienting to be in that setting in Liberia without the benefit of the kind of things that we just take for granted, like running water and the like. But we also had to go through military checkpoints, and so it was unnerving. And then in Malawi, we were put under house arrest for some days because of some unrest in other parts of the country earlier, and it was a lot of poverty there. And I just remember in both of those places being struck by the faithfulness of people in the midst of all kinds of despair and disruption. And that was a bit disorienting. Then in 1992, I was in Buenos Aires, and I saw these disparities of a very few people who were very, very wealthy, the elite. These masses of people lived in these barrios. And so I make reference of being in a vehicle and riding and seeing people trying to salvage stuff out of a dump, a garbage dump. And I do remember that was when the question hit me in a particularly strong way of, just where is God when people have to go through this? And so, my being a Black American, then these other questions were also informed by the history of racism, of slavery, of Jim Crow laws, of legalized segregation, and then of cultural practices of exclusion, of oppression, of marginalizations, implicitly and explicitly, structurally and culturally. So all of these were accumulations, I think, of experiences that led me to raise this question. And then I was also a pastor, and there are times where people go through very, very difficult experiences.
Yeah.
And it's a fair question to inquire as to where is God. So while I make note of that in the preface to the first one, because that's when the question kind of crystallized for me, it was a part of a larger, I think, implicit conversation that was going on internally to me, both existentially and pastorally, as to where is God. And then, of course, there was a 2007 edition. And at that time, you had other kind of war and dislocation from Eastern Europe and Africa and Asia, Latin America. There was just a couple of years after the devastations of Hurricane Katrina. And then since then, there have been continued experiences and my long engagement in global missions. Right. And so, working with people who were devastated by the HIV/AIDS pandemic around the world, working with people who are victims of human trafficking, working with people who live just vulnerable to corruption and government ineptitude, but people are still trying to be faithful. And they're still loving God and doing the best they can, but sometimes they still ask, where is God in this? And there's some people who, would want to say very easily, well, God is always with us, God is always there. But it's a little easier to say when you are in some sense of orientation, right? And when your family is intact, health is intact, and your world is not rocked by things that have to do with human evil, human ineptitude, disease, natural disaster. So all of those things, I think, are a part of what helped me come to pose that question. And I still think that it is a legitimate question for people to ask. And as you know, it's my conclusion is that while we may experience what I've described as Godforsakenness, and it's real for us, and it's real for many people, where they're not able to access God and experience God in ways that either they have known before or that they have come to expect. So they experience absence, but there's a supra reality. There's another reality that God is present even when we experience absence. And one way of describing that that I've tried to unpack it for people is that imagine a toddler who is in a room with a loving parent, and there's a thunderstorm outside. So you can hear the rain, hear the wind, hear the thunder, and it's at night. And then there's a clap of thunder, and the lights go out. And just because of the brain development and sensory perception of a toddler, when the lights go out, when they cannot see the presence of the loving parent who had been a comfort with all the storm in the light, when they cannot see it, their experience will be maybe abandonment and absence. But the parent knows how to make the parent's way through the darkness to the child. So while there is a real experience of abandonment, of absence, of forsakenness, a real experience, a real reality, human reality, there is a supra reality. There's a larger reality. And so those questions were crystallized for me, and my journey through this project and the research and reflection led me to affirm that indeed God is with us, even when we experience God's absence. God is still present.
Yeah, that's thank you for that. That's real helpful. I like that. I like that analogy. It's very, very helpful. And we'll come back to talk a little bit more about Godforsakenness a little bit more here in a moment or two. One of to sort of follow up on the question, and you drew attention to the 2007 edition. One of the things that struck me in reading the preface for the 2007 edition is that you talked about how the question, where is God in this, became a conviction. There was a language there, you talked about it. It became more a conviction than a question. And I think you probably might have you've already touched on that. But if you want to elaborate a little further about that, what do you mean by it being a conviction? Because that's more than just simply that being a question that we hold it in front of us, and use it as a way to refract our life experiences, and reflect. Conviction communicates something much more deeper, much more fundamental, at least to me. So could you talk for just a brief moment about that, as that transition from question to conviction, and what do you mean by conviction?
Let me ask you, when you hear conviction, what does it mean as you hear it?
Well, I think of convictions as sort of core central beliefs and values that I hold. And often those are, and I don't disassociate that at all from the communities that I'm a part of. Usually the communities are vital in the formation of those convictions and those values that I hold. And these are again central and core. So they're not closed off to being negotiated, but usually it means that significant experiences that sort of rock and shake oneself, one's understanding of God, and whatever those experiences may be. Usually those kind of life events is when they might be shaken, but usually they're central in their core. So when I think of that, when I hear you say that, it's just not merely a question now. It's fundamental to how I look at the world, how I think about the world, how I engage the world. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what it means to me when I think about conviction and how I think about it, at least how I understood, or at least I interpreted your transition from question to conviction. So
yeah, and thank you for naming that. So because I often say in my teaching, and I'm sure you do in yours, words matter.
Oh yeah.
And I often ask students to unpack that for me. I learned that from my father. You say, I need to unpack that. Because it can be dense. And so I think what I was saying in the because that was a little more than 10 years, a decade or so, when it was reissued. The book was first issued by the second one was by Fortress, the first one was by Orbis.
Right.
And so what I was trying to say is that the guiding the project the first time around was the question,
right,
of exploring the question. And because I had explored the question, I think the question is still serious and important, an honest question. But the question of where is God that was driving me was not driving me a decade later. So so I was not driven by a question in that intellectual project the same way a decade later. And my experiences around things like human trafficking, HIV/AIDS, and war and stress, and serving among people, then that conviction that yes, God is with us. So that's what was guiding me.
Yeah. Okay.
A decade later, than the inquiry.
Right.
So it was more of a confession.
Okay.
That the question is still real.
Right.
But my conviction is, even though the question is real, my conviction is that yes, God is with us, in spite of the horrors and the terrors that we experience. And I think part of the challenge is that we want the human side of us wants to tie up the loose ends tightly and quickly. And I think part of our challenge is our arc is too short. If our time frame of how long we've had trouble before it gets better.
Right.
How long I've been sick before I get well. And people like to quote quite out of context. I think weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. I think people ought to read the whole text, but we like to do that, but we want the night to be relatively short. And if we're thinking about God's economy, there are a lot of people and a lot of situations and a lot of things that are at play that are beyond our ability to understand. And I think anybody, you and I are middle-aged now. So we can look backwards and see the hand of God at work now, in retrospect, in various ways. Where it was just impossible to see that, because some things you cannot see until you look back on it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, that decade of looking back on that question, I had to answer. It does not make the question any less valid.
Right. No. Yeah.
Because
it's still a very
Godforsakenness is still real.
Absolutely.
Existentially real.
Yeah.
And there is an answer. And I was challenged once by a therapist and counselor who worked with people who had been abandoned, who had been battered and abused. And the counselor therapist said to me, that's not satisfactory to me, that God is with us. And I said, that's all I've got. And I didn't say it as a way of giving up or surrendering. It's all I have. And that's enough.
Yeah.
That God is with us. And time again, God has demonstrated that God comes through in God's time according to God's will. And what is difficult for us to do is to remove ourselves from the axis of our own lives.
Right. Yeah.
And so we want to be center. And we're not the center.
Right.
We're operating in another galaxy. I mean, it's kind of like the people who used to think that the world was the center of the universe. And for them, everything revolved around the world, around the earth. And they were committed to it, but they were wrong. And so the earth is a part of a larger constellation, and there are other things going on. And whatever we are dealing with, my faith conviction says that there's a larger plot that I'm not the center of.
Right.
And that goes against the egocentric nature.
It does.
Of humanity. The old, when you and I were in school talking about pride as being one of the sins.
Right.
And we are so egocentric that we want things to work out for me. But everything is not designed for me. I am a part of God's design. And, I'm a part of what God is doing in God's world. And I may never see it. I may never understand it. And I believe that when your vision is too small, then you can draw conclusions about the unfairness of God and the lack of justice in God, because things are not resolved through my eyes on my time frame.
Right.
And I'm not that human centric to believe that God is obligated to do whatever God is doing in ways that I can comprehend in ways that are on my time. And so I just think the question is real and the experience is real, but there's a larger reality at play. And I think that's an invitation of faith to bet my life on what God has done through Jesus Christ and how God's presence continues to make God's self known through His Spirit.
Thank you for that. That's excellent. And I think that might be a really good segue to talking about slave religion as you talk about it in the book, because as I understand um, slave religion, as I understand what I call with my students Black theology before Black theology, that I hear everything that you just said as having deep historical, spiritual, and theological roots, and what you do in Black Christianity in the antebellum period of the United States. So I want to turn there for a moment, if we can. So because a major portion of the book engages slave religion, and so and you've already probably done this for us, I think. At least I hear this. But how would you want to talk and share with our viewers how you characterize, how you understand the Christianity practiced by African American slaves? How do you understand that Christianity as theological? And how would you discuss the significance and the influence and the legacy of slave religion for the Black church today?
Well, I think one of the challenges that some people who do academic theology is try to make it an intellectual enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And theology is an existential enterprise. And that does not mean that there is no intellectual weight. And it does not mean it's minimized. But we are not disembodied minds. And central to Christian theology is the incarnation.
Right.
The flesh, the word
Mm-hmm.
Became flesh and dwelt among us as existence. Mm-hmm. And so the Black Christianity takes very, very seriously the existential aspect of faith. What we experience in the whole of our bodies and minds and our spirits. So it's not an intellectual enterprise where we can systematize it and theorize it and conceptualize. All of that helps to interrogate, but it starts with the word becomes flesh.
Yeah.
And so the religion of enslaved people, the question of where's God is not a theoretical question. Yeah. The whole reason that the question comes up is because of the terrorism with which they live. Mm-hmm. And, when I talk about, Godforsakenness, I talk about expressions of it in terms of family separations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of physical violence and of sexual exploitation, and then just the absolute disarray of life at the end of slavery. And so it's in these difficult situations that are not as a result of what people have done that they brought it on themselves. It was imposed on them.
Right.
By the evil in human hearts. And so slave religion is encountering God and making sense out of life when everybody with power around you tells you your life has no meaning. And slavery in the United States, enslaved people were considered chattel.
Right.
So when people would inventory their tools and their possessions, they would inventory that they would include in the inventory the people who they quote own.
Right.
Or when I was rereading, before we were talking, I was on a plane earlier, and I was rereading parts of the slave narratives that I include to help describe this experience of forsakenness. And to read about slaveholders who would dig a hole in the ground to accommodate a pregnant woman's belly so that her back would be flat and they would whip her until she bleeds. Or to yank somebody through a barbed wire fence. Or to beat people, to string up their arms and to whip them until they bleed and blood was pooled, and then to put salt water on it. When you live with that, you got a legitimate question of where is God? And so I don't know what to do with these folks who don't want to talk about slavery in schools.
Right. Yeah.
Because there was nothing that the slavocracy, meaning the slaveholders and those who benefit, nothing that they ate or possessed or enjoyed, nothing that was not planted, harvested, provided, built, constructed by enslaved people.
Right, exactly right. Yeah.
And if the Confederate States had been a legitimate independent nation in the 1860s, they would have been the 12th largest economy in the world. Only because
Slave
of
labor,
the unpaid labor of enslaved people and the stolen wealth from the indigenous people, the natural resources. And so it's ludicrous for people to dismiss that. And so when people even see somebody who is black, they say, "Oh, I'm colorblind. I don't see your color." What you're saying is you don't see my legacy. You don't see that people were beaten and whipped just because people are mean enough and honorary enough and sinful enough to do it and working out their aggressions. You don't see where white slaveholders and where the people who were the overseers would rape Black women just because they wanted to work out their sexual aggression. And then the women be punished by white women who were married because they were offended that their husbands had raped the slave. Right. Or somebody would sell a raped slave away from her family because saying that my son or my husband raped her and it's her fault. Right. And so when you live in with that, and you even hear rumors that there is a God, you'd be out of your mind not to ask.
Yeah.
It's insanity not to ask, where is God, when people are enduring undeserved and unbearable suffering. And so that is what I discovered in terms of reading these slave narratives. And it was a recurring theme of the brutality and the horror. And then I tried to pick up then songs.
Yes, yeah.
Out of that period to try to figure out what were they saying about God, because they weren't writing books
Right.
or articles in journals,
right.
or doing blogs or podcasts. And so just like Psalms contain theology of Jewish people, the spiritual is a collective resource of it's a theological library.
It is, yeah.
For enslaved people to hear how are they making theological sense, how are they making sense of faith and life amid those brutalities. And so there's a heavy orientation toward the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And there's a heavy explanation and description of how horrible things were, how bad life was. And some kind of way, even though they were introduced to the gospel largely by the slavocracy and a distortion of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like contemporary American evangelicalism that continues to privilege whiteness.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And assumes that people who don't fit that social construct are less human.
Right.
And therefore less deserving of respect and resources. That's a distortion of the gospel. In some kind of way, they were able, the Spirit was able to interpret through that, cut through that, so that they could hear a liberating message that God does not will this for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that you are human, you're fully human. And that's one of the distinctives of the Black Theology Project that comes out of the religion of Christianity of enslaved people, is what I argue is essential is the anthropology.
Exactly. Yeah.
That all people are created in the image of God, and God loves all people, and there are no people of less value for God, and therefore they cannot be less valued for us. And so when you know that I have no less value, whatever you're telling me, it doesn't ring true. It's off key.
Right. Mm.
And that's a part of Black theology is the whole language is an academic term.
Right.
So it's an academic term that gets codified in the 1960s.
Right.
But there are predecessors to it that go back to the Christianity of enslaved African people and their ancestors, that it is born in a crucible of chattel slavery, African traditional religious thought, and Southern evangelicalism.
Right.
And some kind of way, the Spirit puts that mortar and pestle in that and grinds up some, and out of it comes a faith in God that says all humans are valued before God, and that Jesus has taken on flesh that is valued, and we'll follow Jesus into who God wants us to be. And that's what God's dream for the world is. And that is something that the religion of enslaved people, the Christian religion of enslaved people, the Black Theology Project, the classical Black Theology Project, has to offer to white America and to the world. Those pieces of its anthropology and this Christology, those are gifts that would make the world more humane and habitable. And that I learned from reading and listening to our enslaved ancestors.
I think the only thank you for all that, and the word that's ringing in my ear at the moment to characterize everything you just said is you've just been testifying. And also what's in my mind is last fall I had the wonderful opportunity to teach our Black and Womanist theology class for a small group of students, and there were 4 white students in class, and you came. I was great. You graciously gave an hour of your time last fall to speak with the class, and I deeply appreciate that. one of the things that really stands out to me in that class, I assigned a set of readings from slave narratives for the students. That was a tremendously impactful exercise for those 4 students to read those narratives, to read those accounts from former slaves of what they endured, what their experience was. And it was, and for the remainder of the semester, as we were reading the much more Black Theology Project material, Cone and others who have followed, womanist theology, Dolores Williams, Sean Copeland, students kept coming back to those narratives. Those narratives were a touchstone for the students. And it really shaped how they thought through the remainder of the semester. So I'm only saying that to amplify what you just said so eloquently about those narratives. And for viewers, the chapter on those narratives and then the chapter on the spirituals in the books are tremendous chapters, and they're also not easy chapters to read because of the content and the substance that you engage in terms of the existential life experience that is reflected in those narratives and in those spirituals. So that's excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to turn for a moment here. You've already talked about Godforsakenness in a number of different ways. And that's the leaf motif of the book. And I am curious how you would reflect on Godforsakenness in light of our own contemporary moment. And what I mean by that, the last 7, 8 years, if we think about the murder of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and Sandra Bland, massacre at Mother Emmanuel in Charleston, what happened in Charlottesville, just 4 years ago, real recently, the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter. How would you talk about Godforsakenness in light of the last 7, 8, 9 years of our cultural, social, political, religious moment?
Yeah, well, I think it's evidence that the question is still a legitimate question.
Yeah.
That the reality is that if people could access God in ways that we have desired,
Mm-hmm.
or ways that we've been told that it's going to be all right, there's a stark reality that we're experiencing in those. But there's a different reality that I'd like to point out.
Okay.
And that is these horrific experiences have been happening in the United States as long as the United States has been in the United States.
Yeah.
What has happened, the difference is, that the core difference, I think, is that the ubiquity of social media has enabled white Americans to get some glimpses of what a number, not all, but of what many Black Americans have known and experienced all the time. There are some urban settings where there are children who go to school and they've seen people murdered. Mm-hmm. Elementary age school kids. Mm-hmm. They've seen that. 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds.
Tragic.
They've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
The only people who are surprised are white folks who have been living in self-selected segregation and removed from the kind of oppression and marginalization that has been imposed and orchestrated by policymakers, investors, and developers, where they have robbed the kinds of humane creating experiences from neighborhoods. And when you take away job opportunities so people can have gainful employment and have access to, when you take away green spaces in urban areas where people can enjoy the trees and the birds, and it's nothing but concrete and heat.
Yeah.
When you take away hope, and then when you over police that area, anywhere you heavily police, you're gonna find crime.
Right.
Anyway. And so there, it's not a surprise that there have been strategies when police are incentivized for drug arrest. They target certain communities where they can over police it and arrest more people. If you keep on shaking people down, you're gonna find it. If they over policed where young white folks are and stop everybody in the car or walking down the street or in the mall, they'd find whatever they find when they stop Black and brown people. Exactly. Because the data says that Black and brown people do not use so-called illegal drugs any more than white people. As a matter of fact, the data comes out time and time again, it's a little less.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But if it all depends on where you go to hunt as what you're gonna find, and that's what happens. So the difference is the omnipresent social media, and people are sitting there taking cell phone shots. When the police had his knee on George Floyd's neck.
Right.
If it were not for that, people wouldn't know. And if you told them, if you gave testimony, you have a lot of white folks say, "Oh no, that's impossible. That couldn't happen." And so that is different. There is one other. It's been growing, so it's not new. It's just been growing over the last probably quarter century. This phenomenon of having just open so-called governmental leaders who have who are aggressive and violent with their language, stirring up anger and that kind of stuff. That didn't just happen. That's been growing over time.
Yeah.
There's been a particular manifestation in the last few years of having that kind of governmental vitriol and volume.
Yeah.
But again, the temperature has been on. It's just the water is now boiling. So it's gone from simmer to boil over time.
Exactly.
Now that's a little new, because what it has done is it has emboldened people who have racist inclinations to act overtly in ways where they used to act covert. Now that's a little different. It's not it's going back to days of Jim Crow.
Right.
where you would have people acting out against people of color without any consequences. So you have people who feel like they can do that now. That it's not new. It's a recycle of something 50 years, 60 years ago. So I think that the horror means that perhaps more Christians can ask, "Where is God?"
Yeah.
And see, if we believe that the Spirit of God is in believers, then one of the questions is, "Where are you?"
Yeah. Exactly.
You use the word testimony when I was telling. So where is your testimony?
Right.
That the Spirit of God is alive in you, when you can witness these atrocities, these anti-Black atrocities, and anti-brown and anti-Asian, and be silent or be complicit.
Right.
So God, it's I think that the question remains, where is God? And I believe that God is with us, and we ask and plead for God to make God's self known in redemptive ways.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you.
And let me say,
yeah,
that will come through people.
Yeah.
God will make God's self known when we open ourselves to be the instruments in the hand of God, so that we can be salt for the earth and light for the world. And that's not just trying to get people to say some words or pray a sinner's prayer.
Right.
It's more than that.
Yeah, and I think what comes out of the book at the very end is it's an ethic of witness. I mean, I think there's that follows with everything that you've laid out in the book, and so it there is that question at there. Where is God in all this? And if I'm moved, and if looking at where is the Spirit within me, for me translates into the question, okay, how am I going to bear witness in public ways, to what I know, to what I experience, to what I've come to understand. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways to bear witness, though, is sometimes people want to know what can I do. One thing people can do is to come be in relationship with people who live in the face of these atrocities and endure them.
Exactly.
And it's not like a drive-by. It's not like a drive-through. You drive to the window, get your food, and go. It's
right.
How do you make a commitment to, over time, to be in relationship? And for my white siblings, one thing I would say is, join communities of Black people and where Black people are leading.
Exactly.
And listen and learn and be a part. Don't assume that you ought to have some privilege, or come and learn and listen and be a part. And over time, you can learn how I can incarnate
exactly
the presence of the living God in this place, and not feel like, well, the problem is so big, what can I do? Well, we all participate. It's not all on you. See, that's part of that egocentrism.
Right.
That we think that we got, if I can't fix it, then my contribution is irrelevant. No. You're a part of what God is doing. Play your part. And somebody else is playing their part, and somebody else is playing their part. Somebody's planting, somebody's watering. God gives the increase.
Yeah.
So, you don't have to do something that's going to make the front page, or you can post on your social media. Be in relationship.
Exactly.
In communities of Black people where they experience difficulty, distress, dislocation, all of that stuff, and listen and learn and let, there's an old spiritual song that says, let Jesus lead you into the way of how can I be a sister and a brother? How can I be a sibling in this journey we're on?
Excellent. That's an excellent challenging, hopeful word for our viewers. So I've got one last question, and this is I've not been a good manager of time because we've gone on longer than I was told that we ought to go, but the conversation and what you've been sharing has been so rich.
Thanks. We'll let the producers worry about that.
There you go. I have one last question, and this is where you can talk about yourself a little bit more. Just to let viewers know, including myself, what are you working on right now? What can we expect from the mind and the heart and the soul and the imagination and the pen of David Goatley in the future, the near future or the long-term future, or both? What projects are you working on? What can we anticipate?
Well, in terms of publishing, one is I am a co-executive producer and the host of a podcast.
Okay.
Called Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving.
Okay.
And it's 36 episodes of conversation with Black pastoral leaders. Half are women, half are men. And they're talking about flourishing ministry.
Oh, excellent.
And so that's one project that I'd invite our listeners. Again, it's an audio podcast, wherever you get them, or you can just type in a search engine.
Okay.
Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving.
Well, and hopefully, pardon me. Hopefully, the producers will capture that link and put it somewhere in like show notes or something, so viewers can quickly get there. So okay.
Great.
Yeah.
I had in the last year, I had an article about forming leaders in crisis in a journal for supervised ministry. And then in Ecumenical Review, which is an international piece around ministry in the COVID pandemic.
Okay.
So those are a couple, and I'm hoping to do some more work around leadership, because I live in an intersection of liberation theologies, contemporary missiology, and leadership strategies. And so that's a part of how we can help support and form leaders to do good and faithful service. So those are some of the recent projects that are out, and I'm working on a longer term project around leadership that I hope that it's the way that I frame it is leadership from the Black church for the whole church.
There you go. Excellent.
And we can help people if people will let us.
Okay. I'm looking forward to that, to all of those. And I'm looking forward to that longer project you're working on, because I've got a little preview of that last year. So I'm excited about that. So David, thank you so much for taking some time to talk about your book. Were you there? And I hope viewers will now go out and purchase copies and read it, and if not, organize some reading groups around it and study it and reflect on it. So so I'm grateful that I've had a chance to kind of host and lead some questions with you around this most excellent book. So so viewers, thank you for watching, and may the peace of Christ be with you.